Before moving forward into testing our iOS application on an iOS simulator, let's first learn how to create an Android simulator. Now, Visual Studio already creates 4 simulators that you can use right from the beginning, but just in case you want to create a new one, either because you want to test your app on a different simulator with a different Android API or for any other reason, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to create one. So you will have to start in a button that is to the right of the Run button on the toolbar in Visual Studio. That button is the Open Android Emulator Manager button, which is right here. If you don't see it, you can always go to the Tools menu, select Android, and select Android Emulator Manager, which notice has the exact same icon as the option that we have on the toolbar. So you can select this option, and it will open the AVD Manager, or Android Virtual Device Manager. In here you will see at least 4 emulators, which are created by default by Visual Studio. But all of them probably have an API level of 23. Now in this lecture we're going to create a new one, which could have a different API level, like this one that I have created myself, or just have the exact same API level, but maybe a different CPU or ABI, or maybe just a different device that is being used. So let's click on the Create button and start creating our new AVD. First, I will just call it My Device 2, because I already have a My Device. Then I will have to select the device. It is in here where you will select the size of the simulator that you will want to create. So here you will actually see a list of many popular phones, so you know a little bit more about what phone you're going to be testing this, but it's really just deciding what size or screen size is the simulator going to have, what screen resolution, and what DPI. For example, we could select the Nexus 5, which has a 5-inch screen, a 1020 by 1920 resolution, which is XX HDPI. I will then select the target, which again you can select the same API level 23 for the previous Visual Studio simulators, or you can select another API level that you have installed. I will continue to select this API level 23. Once you have selected the API level, you will have to select the CPU or ABI. And you will see listed all of the CPUs that are installed for that particular target. I do recommend, highly recommend, that you select the CPU that uses an x86 architecture instead of an ARM architecture. This will allow your simulator to use HAXM, Intel HAXM, which we installed when we installed Visual Studio, to make your simulator just much faster. You can always select an ARM-based CPU if you don't have an Intel chip or if you haven't installed the necessary tools, but know that actually having selected an Intel Atom x86 CPU will make your device much faster. Then you can select whether or not you want the hardware keyboard to be present, select the skin. This is just, as you can see, screen resolutions. I am just going to keep this as no skin. I won't change anything in the front camera or back camera, but you could in here. One important thing that you have to keep in mind is changing the memory options, which by default are going to be associated with the device that you selected. For example, for the Nexus 5, 2 GB of RAM have been assigned. Now, I do recommend that you keep this in mind depending on how much RAM you have available. Because if you only have about 4 gigs of RAM, you don't want 2 gigs of RAM to be assigned to your emulator. So just keep that in mind. In my case, I could just change this to 1024 and hit on OK. Before hitting on OK, you could also change the amount of storage in the internal storage and SD card. I won't be changing any of that. I will just click on OK. And after a few seconds, you will see the result of creating that new AVD. In this case, it was successfully created and it tells you exactly what was assigned, which Android version is going to be using, and what processor has been assigned as well. Then you can click on OK, and just close the AVD. For Visual Studio to recognize this new AVD, you may need to close it and reopen it. Once you have reopened it, you will now be able to find that new AVD listed with all of the other simulators. So here I previously had selected one Visual Studio simulator, but now I can also select my device too, which is the one that I have just created. So this was just a quick look at how to create new AVD or new Android virtual devices, new Android simulators. Now, in the next lecture, let's jump into testing our iOS application on an iOS device, which I've already mentioned requires a couple more steps than on Android because we have to make sure that our Visual Studio is connected to our Mac computer.